guys probably know by now my little spiel that I have to say every time that before we begin. I need to tell you it's being recorded. It'll be available on a podcast and on YouTube, so please remember to silence your phones. And in the event of a fire, I think by now maybe all of you know that the assembly point for the old theatre is outside the Soar Suite Hock building, and we'll guide you there. So with that out of the way, it is my great pleasure to welcome you back to the Cutting Edge Issues in Development series that's hosted by the International Development Department. In today's session, we're going to be talking about whether the kind of responses to the climate crisis in the form of green transitions, are they perpetuating or are they addressing inequality? And I know that this is something that you guys are very interested in, thinking about the implications of development amidst the climate crisis. It's also a very topical issue given what's happening right now in Baku, which I think Annalisa will talk about. And so to help us understand these dynamics and to thinking about development in the climate crisis, we're joined by a panel of perfect guests. So first of all, we are joined by Annalisa Prizzon, who is the Principal Research Fellow at the Overseas Development Institute, or the ODI, where she works on a range of issues surrounding public finance in development, including bilateral and multilateral development aid, as well as external public debt sustainability. She wears two hats. She's both an academic with a PhD in economics and public finance, as well as a very experienced policy advisor who, beyond ODI, has worked as a professional economist in international organizations such as the OECD and the World Bank. So we're very, very lucky to have her come and speak with us this evening. And secondly, we have Amir Lebdioui, who is an associate professor of the political economy of development, and he is the director of the Technology and Management Center for Development at the University of Oxford. He's also a former colleague of ours, and so it's really wonderful to have him back this evening. Like Annalisa, he's a development economist whose research has focused on economic diversification of resource-dependent nations, green industrial policy, and low-carbon innovation. And like Annalisa, he's also worked with governments and international institutions on green industrial policy. He's published in a lot of leading journals, but he's also got a new book out, which is called Survival of the Greenest: Economic Transformation in a Climate-Conscious World, which I encourage you all to read, and I know he has some copies, so if you're excited, you can get a copy at the end of today's session. And finally, we have a wonderful discussant, our own Parth Bhatia, who is a doctoral student in our department. He is a former associate fellow of the leading Indian policy think tank, CPR, on their initiative on climate, energy, and environment, where he worked on the political economy of India's low-carbon electricity transition. His current project is thinking about how digitization is shaping India's transition to electrical vehicles, and he's thinking about it in relation to automation of car factories towards the digitization of public transport, trying to understand what the implications of digitization, both for the green transition as well as India's structural transformation. So I can't wait to hear his comments at the end of our session today. So we're first going to hear from Amir. We're going to give both of them 20 to 25 minutes, and then we're going to give Parth a chance to open up the discussion with some comments and questions. So please welcome our speakers to tonight's event.
Good afternoon. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Lara, for the invitation. It's very nice to be back at LSE. I must say I'm very jealous of all of you, and you're also very lucky to be in this department. For me, it's been a very fruitful time, and this is actually where I started to work on green industrial policy issue. And I remember the openness of everyone who was very keen to share information. LSE is very special, not least because of its size. So there are many universities around the world, but universities are all packed and concentrated in central London, where everybody has to mix and mingle. not that many. So this is a great place to be, and I hope that it's as good as a time as it is for you than me when I was a fellow in the department. Before I start, so I'm not going to use any slides. Annalisa will. She has both PowerPoint and powerful points. I think I have neither. I don't have one. I hope I have some points that are useful to share. But I'll be quick because I know that we also, we want to listen first and foremost for her. And I hope that she's going to give a picture is more optimistic than what I'm about to share with you. But before I start, I wanted to ask a question. Can you raise your hand if you think that the global green transition will reduce inequalities? Inequalities between and amongst nations. Raise them in a less shy way so we can see. Not many. Can you raise your hand if you think that it will increase inequalities? Wow, that's a pessimistic cohort. Okay, good to know. So, I have 3 main points to share, but first about the book, which is called Survival of the Greenest. The main message of the book is really inspired from Charles Darwin's thinking around evolution. Right? Charles Darwin has said that it's not the most of the intelligent of the species that survives, not even the strongest. It's actually the species that are able to best adapt and adjust to the changing environment in which they find themselves. That's true of us as human species. It's true of you as students as well, after your degrees. It's not the smartest one that will go further. It's the ones that will adapt best. It's also true of nations and development strategies. And today we're seeing so many changing trends, from climate change, pandemics, and so on, global decarbonization. And this really conditions, right, the optimal development strategies that countries can pursue. And so the main message of the book is that going green in this context is not just an ecological act, it's also an act of macroeconomic resilience, right? Even for countries, especially African countries, who haven't caused climate change. It's not their responsibility to mitigate their emissions. Even in those countries, sometimes going green is still the most optimal route to industrialization. However, and when I say survival of the greenest, it's not just for the sensational aspect of it. Sometimes it's literally a matter of survival, economic survival, right? Think about a country like Nauru. How often do you come across the case of Nauru in your studies? Very little, right? Would you believe me if I tell you that Nauru used to be one of the richest nations in the world in terms of income per capita in the 70s, right? $27,000 of income per capita. But it's basically a horror story of development economics, because they became rich through the extraction of their rich phosphate deposits, but the extraction was done in an environmentally damaging ways, right? So they destroyed the arable land, which used to be the main source of income, right, for local livelihoods through agriculture. And 3 decades later, the inevitable happened. They ran out of phosphate, right? So they went back from being a high-income country to being a low-income country. And the reason why you may hear of Nauru nowadays, in the context of economics and their government, is the fact that the islands being used, the main source of income is that the islands being used as a refugee detention center on behalf of Australia, right? So this is pretty much basically a horror story, right? But it's not just a horror story, it's also a cautionary tale, right? This can happen, this has happened to many other countries. It can happen to many other countries in the future that depend on non-renewable resources. But what it really teaches us is that it's present decisions that determine future production possibilities, right? In the case of Nauru, now it's too late. You can't just go back in time and change. That decision had an impact on the next 50 years of what the island could do. I'll get closer to this. And so today, when you think about long-term prosperity, it's really important to move towards long-term thinking, right? And that's why the grow now, clean up later strategy is often unsuitable, right? And so I have 3 messages to share. One, the first message, and you'll see that all of them somehow relate to the world of sports. The first one is that yes, there are many opportunities for green economic transformation, right? But they are increasingly consolidated. So the first main opportunity is through the concept popularized by Carlota Perez, Rasmus Lema, Xiaolan Fu, Roberta Rabiotti, the concept of green windows of opportunity, right? And these are the opportunities that exist for industrialization through the deployment of low carbon technologies, right? So you deploy renewables, it creates backward linkages, all the industries around solar panel manufacturing, for example, or all the energy intensive industries that could leverage a clean energy source. That's what China has done very successfully. The second great opportunity lies in putting energy at the core of the so-called fourth industrial revolution. Now with the advent of cyber-physical systems, things like artificial intelligence, big data, machine learning, these are things that are extremely energy intensive, right? They consume a lot of electricity. So moving forward, it's very clear that the ability to access a cheap and clean energy source will be key for the uptake of these frontier technologies. That's what Costa Rica has done, by the way, by cleaning up completely its electricity matrix, almost 100% renewables, mostly hydro. They're able to attract investments in high-tech energy activities and manufacturing, because basically what they propose to investors is you just have to connect to the grid and you're already net zero. Wonderful, you're decarbonized, right? So this is a great argument for them. The third one lies in the concept of environmental upgrading, which is a whole different way to look at productivity and value creation, and whereby you generate value through environmental measures, right? So you reduce your waste, you increase your resource efficiency, and that's as a way to reduce your costs, or to be able to actually reuse your waste to enter another industry, another value chain, right? So for example, in agriculture, in Uruguay, dairy farms, through a project with Unido, start to reuse basically cow excrements to produce biofuels, right? And in some of the farms, that's their main source of income, right? So it becomes their primary business as opposed to selling milk. So many opportunities exist, right? We know them, they're technical solutions. It has become more and more obvious. The problem is, for many of those opportunities, you need access to clean energy production, right? You need investment in renewable energy production as a prerequisite. Now, we are seeing record numbers in terms of investment in renewables year after year. If you put it in per capita terms, that's about $180 of renewable energy investment per capita in the US and Canada. There's about 140 in Japan, about 120 in Europe. Guess what's the figure for Sub-Saharan Africa? Take a guess. One? Bold? Who else wants to give a guess? 20? Any other? I feel like I'm selling something at an auction. Another guess? 30? Keeps increasing. The optimism increases. The answer, and I'm sorry to say, is indeed 1. So you get a free book afterwards. $1 of renewable energy investment per capita in Sub-Saharan Africa. And this is the region where you still have almost 600 million people who don't have access to electricity. The region where you actually need job creation, right? The region where you have fantastic potential for renewable energy production. You always hear it everywhere. Every single report praises, right, the natural conditions in Africa for geothermal, for solar, for wind. The conditions are there. But this is not where the investment is going, right? And so that figure, the numbers are all in the book. So I don't have them here so that it forces you to go and get the book. But those figures, what they really show you is that renewable energy investments are not driven by needs, right, or purpose, or ecological sense. They're first and foremost driven by the perception of an economic opportunity, an industrial opportunity to get ahead in the green industrialization race, right? So to improve the carbon cost competitiveness of some countries over others. And this is a big issue. And this disparity, you see it with investment in renewables, you see it with many other indicators. You see it with job creation in low carbon technologies. They're highly concentrated in a handful of countries, mostly China, Germany, the US, some in developing countries, in Brazil and India as well. But then they have a difference between the quantity of jobs and the quality of jobs. And actually, Kati Haschetler in your department, she has this fantastic book on the political economy of energy transitions. And she shows that most of the jobs created in Brazil, for example, which is one of the countries that managed to create over 1 million jobs around renewables, but most of these jobs tend to be low-skilled, low-paid, temporary, mostly in sugar plantations for biofuels, or kind of low-skilled maintenance of solar farms, in contrast to the jobs created in the US or Germany or China, for instance. You see the same pattern for the exports of low-carbon technologies. 3 countries, China, Germany, US, account for half of low-carbon technology exports globally, right? And what that means is that developing countries are punished 3 times. They're first punished because they are a lot more vulnerable to climate risks and transition risks because of the kind of things that they produce and exports, which are more vulnerable to temperature and precipitation fluctuations. 2, credit rating agencies. It's not enough to be vulnerable to those, but on top of it, credit rating agencies are increasingly taking those risks into account, right, when developing their country scores. Right? So if there is a perception that this country will be negatively impacted by climate change, then it costs these countries even more to borrow money. Right? So it costs them more money to try to deal with the problem. And 3, they're even pushed out of the diversification opportunities that arise from global decarbonization, right? Because a lot of the jobs, of the manufacturing, of the value is being generated in a handful of countries. So in that sense, it's a big issue. And as things stand, the global decarbonization stands it won't fulfill the central promise of the UN development goals of leaving no one behind. Even worse, it will push the poorest even further behind. So, and by the way, a little parenthesis here. Everyone talks about critical minerals these days. It's the hot topic along with hydrogen and other things. And you often hear that critical minerals are the entry door for developing countries to join and upgrade in green value chains, right? If you have a lot of lithium and cobalt, that's the way that you integrate this new economy. But in practice, that is just not happening, right? You don't see it happening. And the few countries in the global south are actually really able to develop export-oriented green manufacturing capabilities. Interestingly, it's not because of their natural resources, it's because of the pre-existing industrial capabilities. So Malaysia, which has managed to become the 2nd exporter in the world of solar cells, it actually leveraged its pre-existing capabilities in the electronic sector, which is also a great story of industrial policy, but we'll leave it for another talk. Because the technology you need for solar panels is very similar to what you need for general consumer electronics. In Brazil, which exports or produces wind turbines, right? They were able to leverage pre-existing capabilities in aerospace engineering. At Brazil, there's only 4 large aerospace companies in the world, or like producing planes. Brazil, Embraer is one of them. It's Brazilian, and basically the whole technology for plane turbines was very useful, right, to develop wind turbines. And with critical minerals, let's not forget one thing: is that criticality, what's critical today, might not be critical tomorrow, right? Criticality is really bound by time and space. So cobalt today is a critical mineral, but there's no guarantee, like same with lithium, that in 10 years it will still be critical, because you need it mostly for electric batteries, right? But there's a lot of resources being poured into R&D for alternative electric batteries that don't use any of those minerals, right? Sodium-based batteries, solid-state batteries, hydrogen-based batteries. So no one can tell you in 10 years which are the minerals that will still retain their value. So that poses even more uncertainty on developing nations. So from this point, now that we're really pessimistic, developing countries has essentially, simply speaking, two choices. One, you adopt a neoclassical framing, and you think, well, let's stick to our comparative advantages. We don't have any comparative advantage in the green economy, so let's just give up, right? We lost that race. It started already. There are some winners. We'll be the losers of this transition, and you simply give up. The second one is that you adopt a dynamic approach to the acquisition of comparative advantages. You don't give up. You think that there are still things that your country can secure in the context of this green transition. But that calls, from what we know from the literature, especially in heterodox economics, including your Robert Wade, has contributed to that line of thinking. You use industrial policy, all right, to try to, through learning by doing, technology acquisition, try to upgrade learn new things that enable you to secure so the so-called green windows of opportunity. But that entails a whole different scope for state interventions, and this is why what I like to say is that states should behave, should adopt the Zinedine Zidane theory of industrial policy, right? Whereby you don't have to stick to a referee's rule, where you just develop the rules and you enforce them. You don't also have to be the team captain, right? The annoying Cristiano Ronaldo that has to play in the game and has to score the goal and has to, right? You can actually make a huge difference when you're on the sidelines, right? Therefore, Zinedine Zidane, which I like to use because I'm Algerian and we somehow still appropriate him even though he sadly played for France instead. But Zinedine Zidane makes a huge difference on the pitch, right? Because even if he's not playing, he's setting the vision, the strategy, the training that enables to increase the chemistry between the different players, set the targets, enable the whole team to be a lot more competitive as a whole and win international games. So, and this has a lot of implications for how states can intervene, right? So it's not necessarily completely going against market forces, but really thinking about how to best position your country. Now, there's a lot to say on state interventions. Nowadays, you know, it's a lot more popular to talk about. I don't know how much longer it will be, thanks to those weird ideas coming out of the United States. And this, have you heard of this Department of Government Efficiency, when you just want to slash government functions? The irony is that Elon Musk himself, Tesla, largely benefited from government interventions and would have gone bust without it. Have you ever read Elon Musk's biography? Yes, some of you did. Most of you are nodding in disgust. It's really interesting. I read about 10 years ago. I didn't know back then how things would turn out. But anyways, and the whole book is about how he's a creative genius and the entrepreneurial mindset and the resilience and blah, blah, blah. And sure, there's a big part of that. There's about half a page devoted to how Tesla was completely going bankrupt, right? Completely. And got saved by a huge government subsidy, like a subsidized credit, right? During the Obama administration of $500 million given to Tesla and Solyndra, the other EV manufacturer. Solyndra went bust anyways, right? But Tesla, it enabled them to survive, and through learning by doing, give them more time to reach breakthroughs in economies of scale. So from the point of view of the government, it was still worth it, because even though one company went bust, right, the returns that you get on Tesla, paying taxes, if they pay taxes, or the job creation is still worth it, right? But this shows that governments very often intervene, right? But they don't get the credit for it. Anyways, moving forward. On industrial policy, there are many things to say. I think there's a lot that also you've been learning in your degrees. So there's just one thing that I'll mention here on the kind of coordination that you need for industrial policy that you did not have for standard industrial policy. Typically, industrial policy has been the mandate of the powerful Ministry of International Trade and Industry in many countries, right? But with green industrial policy, that's impossible, because you cannot have a green industrial policy from the Ministry of Trade and Industry and have an energy policy from the Ministry of Energy that is not aligned with the green industrial policy, and the environmental policy that is also not aligned. Environmental regulations can be very important, right, to generating demand for goods that green industrial policy wants to support. The European Union shows that. So you need coordination amongst a wider range of stakeholders, right? So in countries like Malaysia, this has been the role of the Economic Planning Unit, which is a strengthened unit within the Prime Minister's office, and they really oversee what other ministries do. They adjust all this incoherence and so on. In China, and I think this is one of the greatest lessons we can learn from the Chinese industrial policy experience, is this process of institutional trial and error. They try things out, they change it, they adapt, they adjust, and it can go as far as what they did in 2013, which was to completely eliminate the Ministry of Energy. They just realized that energy is such a cross-ministerial, cutting issue. You can't have it in only one ministry, it creates too much tension. So instead, they have a National Energy Commission, right? In Brazil, is anyone Brazilian here? No? So they didn't have this kind of coordinating unit, which means that at the moment they have 5 different ministries with 5 different green industrial policy strategies, which has some overlap but a lot of confusions, right? A lot of trade-offs. And this is why this kind of institutional coordination is extremely important nowadays. It makes it more difficult, but more worth it. And now my final message is about the direction of green industrial policy. And here the point I want to make is green industrial policy is not just about manufacturing low carbon goods like solar panels or wind turbines. It can be much broader. And in fact, rich nations are making it very difficult for developing nations to pursue the same strategies to produce the same goods that they're producing, because it's a threat to their markets, right? Which is why, as a great economist once said, who happened to be my PhD supervisor, as a disclaimer, Hajun Cheng, he wrote this book called Kicking Away the Ladder, right? Have you read it? Cool. That should be mandatory reading, right? Yeah. So nowadays, you see the same process of kicking away the green ladder. And you see it in horrendous ways and very subtle ways. So, can you raise your hand if you think that bicycles are not environmentally friendly? Okay, no one. Can you raise your hand if you think that bicycles are environmentally friendly? Okay, most of you. I agree with you. The European Union would disagree with all of you. Because if they had agreed to include bicycles as an environmental good in the environmental goods agreement of the WTO, they would have had to remove tariffs on Chinese bikes, and would have wiped out the Italian bicycle industry. So the Chinese saw it as a point of hypocrisy. They pulled out of the agreement, and this is one of the big reasons why we still don't have an environmental goods agreement at the WTO. This is one of many examples, by the way. If you look into the examples, it's a standard modus operandi, and it really shows that, climate action very often is driven by trade and industrial interest first and foremost. So, what do you do if you're a developing country? You can't replicate what others are doing. There are blocked routes to green industrialization. By the way, same with climate financing, right? We always talk about the financing that was agreed, $100 billion, right, since Copenhagen. The US is the one that missed its target the most. Right, about $40 billion that it missed every year in climate finance payments. That may seem like a large number, right? But if you put it into perspective, it cost the US government in the same time period $1 trillion to develop the F-45 fighter jet, which has been deemed not only the most expensive, but also the least used weapon in military history. So just to put it into perspective, the money is there. It's just not used in the right purposes. There is one person that said, don't tell me what are your priorities, show me your budget and I'll tell you what are your priorities. And I think that says a lot about this agenda. So, there are many ways in which countries can actually do green industrial policy that don't have to do with emissions, right? The narrow focus on carbon emissions reflects Western responsibilities for climate change. But there are many other ecological goals that we have to deal with: material waste, material pollution, like plastic pollution in oceans that affect human health and nature, biodiversity loss. If you destroy your biodiversity to put solar panel factories, that's not sustainable development. And that's why there are many other ways that countries can find to do green industrial policy in a way that aligns with their interests and their needs and their priorities. So biodiverse country, for example, could leverage their biodiversity as a bank of ideas for innovation, right? Small countries still have to do industrial policy, but they have the challenge of coordination with one another, which other countries don't have necessarily, right? So coordinate markets, policy tools, so that you maximize synergies across nations. And last, and this is the final point of the book, industrial policy, we need to learn, it's risky, right? It's risky, it's costly, it can fail miserably, it has failed miserably in the past, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't try to do it, because you should look at the cost of the alternative and the risks of the status quo, right? What happens if you don't change your productive structure? And most importantly, it's okay to fail. And we should have an approach to green industrial policy that has a higher tolerance for failure, right? Because you don't learn, right? If you don't fail and learn from your mistakes. And that's something that hasn't happened. That is a commonality amongst most experiences, successful experiences of industrial policy, that you never get it right the first time, right? But you improve. So this is one of the other lessons we can learn from sports, from the glorious yet vastly unpopular sport of curling. Have you ever watched curling? I thought, oh, you did? Ah, not bad. I haven't, but I know what it's about. So if you look at the difference between bowling and curling, right? The point is industrial policy should be a lot less like bowling, more like curling. Because the whole point is not you try to get your target the first time you reach it, and you hope that you touch, how's it called? This little things, right? With curling, you have these two people on the side that do this weird grooming. But what they do is they adjust the trajectory, right, of that little spinning thing so that it meets a target. And that's something that is needed, monitoring and evaluation and adjustment over time. And as Nelson Mandela said, I never lose, I either win or learn. So that's something that we should adopt in green industrial policy. So thank you very much for your attention, and look forward to the discussion.
Get myself organized. It would be a very difficult art to follow, Amir. Definitely it is. And there are many connections in the discussion. I'm not touching the football one because it's a touchy one for the Italians, but many connections. My father was in the bicycle business, and so many kind of elements. But good afternoon, everyone. So pleased so many of you are here on a Friday afternoon. And I have to say, I need to start with a confession. And it's not just about a rhetorical technique or captatio benevolentia, as we say in Latin, just to try to win your sympathy, but it's genuine to stress how important and unavoidable these conversations are for every single one of us, whatever our career paths of aspiration to bring about positive change. In my studies as work, I've mainly kind of focused on how to make the most of scarce concessional finance, particularly navigating the geopolitics and the different policy priorities of donor countries. And I have to be entirely honest, I used to know very little about climate finance, low carbon transition, adaptation. I think it was back at my time when I did public finance at university, and please don't ask me how many years ago that was. I'm just kind of, please don't ask. But so you might wonder why Laura and Deepa invited me today to speak. So development and climate are so closely intertwined that no one can ignore. Amir kind of mentioned that many times. But their impact in framing and addressing the issues we're trying to help solve and advance in our jobs in research, government, and advisory. It may sound trite, but actually in practice it's not. And I'll try to kind of speak about a number of examples, but in my own job, I'm kind of hearing all the times about a trade-off between climate and development. And it permeated and sometimes led to a number of tensions in the reform agenda of multilateral development banks, like the World Bank, the African Development Bank. And those trade-offs actually can also shape the way development agencies, foreign ministries, or finance departments actually decide on how to allocate budgets. And I think, I'm not sure if we chose this kind of date by accident, but actually all these tensions are happening as we speak in Baku. I'm not kind of telling you check your Guardian feed, but you will see we are really very much at the heart of the discussions. And why there is a kind of a trade-off? Because there's a lingering misconception that climate action inevitably affects economic development, and that lower income countries should instead focus on poverty eradication. And I think Amir covered a number of those points, but we shouldn't see this as a kind of a black and white, but there are different kind of shades. Why it's not an inevitable trade-off? First of all, because we need to care about the cost of inaction, and that's also a point Amir made earlier on. And inaction on climate change undermines and sets back inclusive development. Think about disasters. I've been told by many colleagues not to call them natural. They're just disasters. So they're nothing but natural, others say. And usually these kind of disasters affect the poorest the most. Second, we need to remind ourselves that technologies evolve, and so the cost-benefit analysis. Again, Amir made this point a number of times in his intervention. I mean, costs are not static. We know that the kind of cost of renewable energies are going down significantly in an exponential way. And we also need to remember that sometimes renewable energy is the solution. Think about off-grid to reach out kind of different populations. So you can't think really about low carbon and fossil fuel options. But there's also a point that I would love to elaborate throughout the discussion. Countries are different. I know it sounds another trite point, but we tend to use a bit of a cookie cutter to make this argument. And there are a number of countries where a low-carbon transition truly represents a transformative opportunity. For others, it's definitely not. And when it comes to the time horizon, we need to think about the short term. Inevitably, there will be job losses, and we need to mitigate them. But those kind of trade-offs tend to kind of weaken as time goes by. And that's primarily also what Amir talked about. And I would like to cite Adriana Abdedur. She's worked with President Lula in the G20 presidency, and she contributed to a symposium in the ODI journal, Development Policy Review. Title is Climate and Development, What Opportunities, What Threats? And thank you for keeping the slide, Deepa, as a kind of a self-promotion in there. But Adriana contributed to our annual symposium, and she left a very clear message, which I want to elaborate throughout the discussion today. The issue is not whether to integrate the climate and development agenda, so she doesn't see a trade-off, but how we do that. So I would say, going back to my initial confession, ignoring the implications of climate change for my own work on development finance, on the reform agenda on MDBs, it was like burying one's head in the sand. That's why I had to leave my comfort zone. I'm still on the learning curve. I will get Amir's book, but I'm going to buy it. The free copies are for you guys. Hopefully less steep, and I'm still kind of keep learning. I hope I can elaborate on two different points. The first one, I would like to illustrate a sort of framework for understanding and navigating the opportunities and threats of the climate and development agendas. As I said earlier this year, we asked a number of scholars from the Global South actually to react to our proposition, and I will elaborate on some of their arguments. Actually, some of them are pretty interesting, I dare say. And second and last, which is much more my kind of comfort zone, I would like to share a practical example where this kind of tension between climate and development emerged, and that's the reform agenda of the World Bank. The World Bank underwent a significant reform process last year, a couple of years ago, called the Evolution Roadmap. And again, This trade-off between climate and development was really clear in the negotiations between Western non-borrowing countries and borrowing countries. There were some positive unintended consequences which, for geopolitics, which I'm going to talk about later on. So, climate change, an opportunity or a threat for development. So, why is climate change an opportunity for development? Because the issues that climate change brings to the fore are very similar to those that matter for development. Overlaps, complementarities, and synergies exist between investment and policies for development and those aimed at mitigating and adapting to climate change. And why is climate change a threat for development? Because trying to reduce emissions, and again, Amir explained that earlier on, could come at the expense of international and national development efforts and might be more expensive or might be perceived to be more expensive than traditional development strategies, meaning that funds and political capital are diverted away from development. We had a number of kind of discussions with my colleagues at ODI. I have to say, I tend not to be picky on things, but this is important. We're no longer the Overseas Development Institute. So, and I think, but it's helped me actually to elaborate on the point. Overseas is a bit neo-colonial, and it's not just about development. So it's much more a kind of global affairs. So we're now ODI Global, and we're moving away from Overseas Development Institute, and we felt as staff that this was the time actually to move to a different kind of name. But that gave me the opportunity to elaborate on this. But anyway, with a number of colleagues at ODI, we reflected on two potential areas of concerns, two conceptual and two practical, when it comes to the kind of interaction between climate and development. On the framing conceptual around fairness and justice and climate positive development, and the practical side on hard budget and just energy transitions, diplomacy, and global governance. Let me elaborate on the different points. On fairness and justice, again, Amir kind of mentioned that earlier on. The people on low income will be the hardest hit by climate change. And they also have fewer resources to build resilience to a changed climate. The damage was done mainly by high-income economies, and yet the price will be paid by all, and disproportionately by people in low-income countries. In principle, high-income economies should cut their own emissions, and they should compensate the citizens of the rest of the world for the loss and damage that heating is causing and will cause, and to assist emerging economies to lower their emissions. I'm not asking you to check the Guardian feed right now, but actually this is the stumbling block of this afternoon. I was hoping to come here and talk about the decisions at COP29 in Baku, but actually we're probably stuck. So the latest kind of document outlines Amir spoke about the 100 billion target. The proposed one, until under negotiations, is 250 billion. You might think, oh, it's twice the amount that was in Copenhagen, but think about inflation. You also need to think about the investment needed. Actually, Professor Stern, Amar Bhattacharya, and Vera Songwe published a very influential report for the high-level panel on climate, and the needs are around 1.3 trillion every year by 2035. You can see that 250 billion is not enough. And also the kind of 250 billion that have been put on the table by the COP chair, it's not explained whether it's going to be grants, whether it's going to be loans, who is going to foot the bill, how these funds are going to be measured. So I'm not sure what's going to happen by the end of today, but certainly it's far away from what the demand from many of the developing countries are. So please keep, not now the Guardian feed, but keep checking later today. The other kind of argument, and this is very close again to what Amir was kind of mentioning, there is an argument around climate positive development. The transitions in energy and other sectors to reduce greenhouse gas emissions represent an opportunity for the Global South, where much of the natural resources and low-cost labor needed to produce clean energy are located. An investment at scale would transform energy supply, enabling cheap electricity to drive local industries and so dynamize entire economies and end reliance on fossil fuels. We haven't spoken today about subsidies for fossil fuels. Again, this will free up, in some cases, significant resources. And let me go to the practical terms. I think I've already kind of spoken at length around hard budgets. Despite the kind of needs, resources are not necessarily mobilized. There are a number of kind of decisions, even in this country, in the UK. Should we support a winter fuel payment, or should we support an international climate target? You have domestic constituencies that you need to kind of listen to, and the budgets are what they are. On the just energy transition, and again, this is the point around not using cookie cutters. Energy transitions in the global south can be way easier for some countries with low emissions. For other countries, however, the changes are formidable. Think about the cases of Nigeria, South Africa. They rely on oil and coal, and they have massive incumbent industries. They invested heavily in carbon, and jobs will be lost. But there are some countries that have different issues, and I'm always kind of thinking about Senegal. Senegal discovered gas relatively recently. Should they kind of take advantage of the gas extraction to fund their own development pathway, or will they be locked into an obsolete technology down the line? And these are very kind of topical kind of questions, and should therefore, for example, international financial institutions like the World Bank support Senegal in that kind of investment in gas? But this is not Paris aligned. So this is again something to bear in mind when we're talking about the practical implications around a low carbon transition. And then again, on diplomacy and global governance is whether actually global cooperation acts up, and we already spoken about the stalled negotiations happening in Baku. So we asked 5 scholars from Brazil, Kenya, India, Nigeria, and South Africa. I would say quite leading scholars. Adriana Dedur, who works actually still with President Lula in Brazil, Abiba Dagash, Navroz Tubash, Jack Kimani, and Carlos Lopez, to react to those kind of overall arguments. And I would say they very much kind of expanded the arguments, but they still came up with a dichotomy, but a very different one. A different one in the sense that on the one hand there were hopes and norms, and on the other side reality and fears. Why norms and hopes? Because the consequences of a hotter world will impede growth and development across the world, and probably especially so in the global south. And that not should be at the expense of rising the incomes and welfare of many millions, most of them in the global south, who live with poverty and deprivation. But there are win-win solutions. I don't like the word win-win, but actually this is one of the kind of few examples I might be able to cite. At the core of limiting global heating is a switch to renewable energy. The global south, Africa in particular, has huge potential to generate solar power. A potential made all the more feasible by the falling cost of the technology itself. The natural resources for the panels and associated batteries exist in Africa, as does low-cost labor, which we shouldn't forget at this stage. The world needs energy, Africa needs jobs and economic growth. Africa has the labor, the natural resources, and the sunlight. That's the kind of place where challenges meet opportunity. And this is a very kind of important point as well. Rather, it is in the interest of developing countries to do development differently. That's the kind of model, again, Amir was talking about. By avoiding high carbon lock-in, which will enhance future competitiveness, and by making development choices that actively encourage resilience. And what's the other kind of side around reality and fears? That's the part I didn't want to talk about. But reality suggests that such promise will be very hard to realize. International finance, public finance, we know that donor countries don't meet the ODA targets. They don't meet the climate target. It was met, the 100 billion, but just a few years later, and around it's now 125. It's very much kind of far behind. And promises of funding made by rich countries have not been met, and sometimes they even counted twice. And one very important point, there is very limited technological transfer. We also have a nationalist discourse in which the short-term domestic priorities prevail, no matter what global problems are mounting. So the existing opportunities cannot and should not be taken to mean that there are universal or that our conditions for their realization are easily satisfied. And we need to recognize there are different resource endowments that shape different opportunities. Ethiopia is a kind of considerable hydropower, but it's a very different situation for gas-rich Nigeria. So this is a bit the framing. Now, I think the much more interesting part, that's probably where I might need a mic, and I get much more kind of excited. It's around what are the implications of this theoretical framework and of the trade-off between climate and development in the reform agenda of multilateral development banks. So in this, on this slide, I just wanted to kind of tell you what I mean by multilateral development banks. The World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, European Investment Bank, African Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, that's not far away here in London, the Islamic Development Bank, the New Development Bank, and I'm also citing a small one called CEB, stands for the Council of Europe Development Bank. It's the smallest one. How many of you did know about CEB? Oh, that's a bunch of fantastic, and it will take the chair of the group of MDBs. But when we're kind of referring to multilateral development banks, these are the kind of actors we're really talking about. They have a number of kind of unique characteristics. First of all, they provide finance at terms that are better than what market can offer, sometimes much kind of lower than what countries could get in domestic and international capital markets. They also come with finance that support project implementation, that's usually referred to technical assistance, but they also support what we call upstream policy advisors, so regulatory frameworks, other areas around kind of systems in countries. They provide research and knowledge. Many of you, I'm pretty sure, kind of read a number of kind of World Bank reports and also a bit of kind of learning across countries. They have very strong convening power, so that means kind of if the World Bank calls, other actors will certainly kind of join a number of endeavors. And that's one important point that I would love to leave you with. They really offer great value for money for shareholders, for their shareholders. So I'm not sure if everyone can see the slide, but actually, if I think about the IFIs, World Bank, IDB, the Asian Development Bank, the African Development Bank, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, they received, since their creation, a total paid-in capital of around 50 billion. So if you're summing up the first column, unfortunately, I had to kind of forgo a line to make it kind of bigger, but trust me, it's around 50 billion. Countries, the shareholders don't have to pay the entire subscribed capital. They pay usually 10-15%. They might need to pay the other 85-90% if many countries borrowing from the World Bank go bust. This is very unlikely. That's called callable capital. But in other words, if the US commits 100 million for the capital of the World Bank, in reality pays only 15 million. So that's how it works. And since the creation of all the banks, inevitably you need to think over time. And the World Bank was created in 1944, and the EBRD just in 1991. But all in all, their cumulative financing is more than 1.5 trillion. That means that on average, they're being able to kind of mobilize 30 times what they receive from shareholders. How does this number compare with the rest? Official development assistance in 2021, in 1 year, donors paid 180 billion US dollars. So it's actually more than three times the amount that all the banks received since the 40s. So I would say, if I were kind of the FCDO or the French Treasury, this is a very kind of good investment instead of kind of going bilateral. There are different motivations to go bilateral, but from an efficiency perspective, the MDBs have a very a business model that offers value for money. So why do we need to reform the MDBs? First of all, as a result also of the crisis, we have greater needs of client countries on finance and policy advice and technical cooperation. Bilateral development cooperation programs are being stable or shrinking, so the MDBs do offer good value for money, and that's a very important point. And we need to kind of get the biggest bang for the buck, because we have really scarce concessional finance. Just to go back on the climate point, the multilateral development banks are out of the 125 billion of climate finance. They actually they provided last year, 75 billion. So this is the biggest chunk. When you think about the climate finance targets, the vast majority of the resources do come from the MDBs. And inevitably we have unprecedented national and global challenges, climate, the pandemic, and peace and security. How can the MDB support a low carbon transition and build resilience to climate change? As I said just 1 second ago, they are the major contributors to the international climate finance commitments. They will continue to do so no matter what is going to be decided in Baku. They pledge to align their operations with the Paris Agreement on climate change. Their regional and global reach to address transboundary challenges put them in a very kind of privileged position, and they can share learning across countries. And they have deep experience in implementing large climate-relevant projects that many countries lack. I repeated here the word challenges. I noticed it just today. I think that's probably the onus of it. But there is a bit of a problem about the MDBs. They have a business model that is around country-based lending. So each country has potentially an allocation for certain MDBs, but they need to borrow individually for projects, including for projects that have either positive or negative externalities. So the reality is that some countries are not willing to pay more, and particularly to borrow, when it comes to financing a low carbon transition. Why do I have to pay? This is again the fairness justice element that I outlined earlier on. So they want to receive grant financing or a buying down of terms, but again, there is not much kind of there is not much concessional finance around there. So the big tension that was happening within the World Bank evolution agenda was, yes, the World Bank now is the strapline of the World Bank is ending poverty on a livable planet. You might want to invest more on global challenges, but you need to pay more. But the World Bank hasn't been capitalized. So this is very much a kind of a tension that is kind of happening. But I mentioned earlier on there was also kind of a positive development as a result. Actually, it created a stronger coalition among the emerging and developing countries within the board. We have a group of G7 plus countries, Western economies, within the board of the World Bank, and a group of G11, India, Brazil, Indonesia. And actually this tension around the shift of the World Bank towards global challenges reinforced the kind of geopolitical relations between these countries. And again, many of you, we can elaborate later on, might have heard around the theory, if that exists, of global public goods. This wasn't particularly helpful within the negotiations. Actually, countries wanted support for global challenges, and global challenges were defined in very different ways from the global south. We might think low carbon transition, renewable energy, but for many it was about water, debt, food security. And again, different kind of ways of interpreting things, which is what I'm going to hand the presentation. So 3 years ago, we launched a survey to client countries to understand the strengths and weaknesses of their perspective on the strengths and weaknesses of MDBs. We surveyed nearly half of the countries that can borrow from the World Bank. We reached out, actually, we received responses to nearly 500 government officials and MDB staff. We asked many questions. I'm also very excited because we're launching the new wave on Monday, and also we helped kind of getting some contacts on the new countries, so it's very much kind of live. We asked a number of questions, and one of them was, where would you like the MDBs to operate? Pick up a number of sectors. So again, we asked and again, I'm clarifying, asking government officials of the relevant kind of MDBs operating in the countries, which sectors should they kind of operate in the next few years? You see a number of kind of recurrent themes: health, water and sanitation, education, agriculture, energy, transport. And then we asked, and this is an unintended consequence of my research because I didn't expect the next point. We also sent a questionnaire to officials in multilateral development banks, usually as a way of triangulation. We didn't ask them what they would like their own MDB to work on. We asked them what they think the government would like them to work on. It was very interesting. On top, there was climate adaptation and mitigation. Climate adaptation and mitigation for the Asian Development Bank. EBRD, climate change adaptation and mitigation. IDB, much closer. The only MDB where there was a bit of an alignment between the priorities of the governments and aggregates and those of the MDBs was the African continent with the African Development Bank. And I learned a lot. As I said, I'm still on a kind of less steep, but still a learning curve. So it's also the way we frame the issues. The climate change adaptation and mitigation is not a sector. It's not, you can have an energy project that's about renewable energy. We didn't capture it here. There's a health project that can support adaptation or education project, agriculture. So in the next kind of edition of the survey, we drop the option of climate adaptation and mitigation, and we're actually asking, if you're picking up the energy sector, where would you like to work, the MDB to work? Gas, fossil fuel, carbon, or solar, wind. So it's also the way we frame the issues that matters. Still, I would say the kind of tension between climate and development does come up with many finance ministries in there, and they need more resources to finance low carbon transition or building resilience. So let me just kind of recap. The trade-off between climate and development exists with a number of kind of caveats, but it's not inevitable. And we need to consider the time horizon, country circumstances, for example. And again, to cite Adriana Abdenur to finish, the issue is really not whether to better integrate the climate and development agendas, but how we do that. And I'll stop here.
If you could all sit down, yeah. Okay. And I'm going to put the microphone close. Okay. So we're now going to open up the discussions with her. And I did ask, I think I asked for kind of an optimistic, I'm listening to you guys talking about the need for optimism, so inshallah.
Okay, so thank you to both of you for these very rich and insightful presentations. I just, as I was preparing for today's session, I actually read both of the works that they talked about, so Amir's book and Annalisa's symposium. Highly, highly recommend reading both of them. They're very, very sort of rich and full of very useful information. So what I'll do is as a discussant, I'll try and sort of synthesize the main positive takeaways from both of your discussions. Laura mentioned that there's been a lot of doom and gloom around the green transition in recent weeks, and it's probably a moment to think about what it is that we know from research that's good, that's useful, that's a sign of progress. And I'll then come back to the panelists with a couple of questions to kick things off. But before I get into sort of the main discussion, I just thought I'll take this opportunity to speak to Amir's question of whether I feel optimistic about whether green transition is going to lead to more inequality or less. And I thought I'll just sort of use 2 or 3 stories to talk about why I raised my hand that it's going to make things more unequal, right? So the first sort of story is that when I was working in a think tank in India, the government of India actually enlisted my think tank along with others to help draft India's long-term strategy on climate change. So the UNFCCC has this document that every government is supposed to submit called the LTLEDS, which is the long-term low emissions development strategy. And we worked night and day with various ministries, and there was a lot of appetite within the government of India to come up with a good and useful strategy. And it was launched just before COP26, which happened in the UK. And then I attended the COP, but then the thing was that the Indian Prime Minister also attended the COP. And we knew from within government discussions that there was a lot of appetite for action on the green transition. The Indian government had been internally talking about putting a lot of money towards green sectors. But then after the COP, when the Indian Prime Minister came back, he had this big speech on India's Constitution Day, launching a big diatribe against carbon colonialism, talking about carbon budgets, carbon equity and responsibility. So certainly something happened at the COP, which was a big moment for the Prime Minister personally. And I think there is something about these settings when equity comes up that developing countries have their skepticism reinvigorated. So that's one story. A second story is about modeling, right? So we know that climate targets have historically been decided by these IAMs, integrated assessment models, which look at both climate science and economics, and they project into the future, and that's how we come up with targets that countries then try and adhere to, the emissions targets. But the core of the projection is not what is happening with the environment or what's happening with natural systems and the climate. The core of the projection is something that's called the SSEP, the Shared Socioeconomic Pathway, which is essentially the narrative of what we think is going to happen to the world, right? And at least over the last decade, there were 5 main SSEPs, sort of looking at different visions of the future. And I think the evidence of the last 2 or 3 years have shown that we seem to be on some of the most negative SSEPs. So SSEP 3 was talking about regional rivalry. So if the world fragments into blocks, which we are seeing happen, and if there's much less cooperation over technology and trade, there's a big chance that the underlying institutions for technology development slow down and for climate slow down, right? And then that actually affects environmental and climate outcomes a lot more. Similarly, SSP4 talks about inequality, right? So if we live in a much more unequal world, the models tell us that we don't really meet our emissions targets, right? So both of these things are sort of things which raise skepticism. And similarly, the third point, which I think Amir has already illustrated, is the capacity of developing countries, right? So my research is on India, my research is on electric vehicles, and like my topic is essentially green industrial policy. It's very much inspired by Ha-Joon Chang's work, and a lot of people who have written about industrial policy as a way of not kicking the ladder, but essentially catching up, right? And when I was looking at the numbers, so India, which is a relatively upper middle income country, the big industrial policy instrument that we have, it's called the Production Linked Incentive Scheme. The total amount allocated by the central government for that is 26 billion, right? And China was able to allocate around $1 trillion-ish for its green sectors. The United States, through the IRA, the numbers are debatable, but people say it's between 500 billion to $1 trillion, depending on how much of that tax concession is actually utilized, right? So even a country like India, which has a relatively high GDP, is still sort of able to only throw pittance in comparison to the developed world, which makes, and this 26 billion is actually our multi-sectoral industrial policy, so it's not just green energy. It also includes textiles and pharma and things like that, right? So just the sheer magnitude of subsidies that are available are so skewed that you cannot escape the conclusion that things are heading in an unequal direction. But I mean, I'm still sort of very optimistic about the industrial policy method, because this is the only thing that we know through history that has actually led to closing of the gap and towards convergence. And that's why my project is about electric vehicles and industrial policy in electric vehicles. But one of the things which I wanted to bring up, and which I think Amir has already touched upon, is technology. So technology is increasingly becoming a core part of industrial competitiveness, right? So the European Union's industrial strategy says we have a twin pillar strategy. It's green and digital together, right? So green and digital are now sort of going hand in hand. And the evidence of recent years is that the advantage in the digital end is also increasing. So the green gap we already know, but the digital gap is also increasing. So people are now talking more and more about monopoly capitalism, the big American companies sort of using AI to further increase their lead over developing countries. And if those sorts of technologies come about, where does the developing world figure in terms of capturing the gains from those technologies, capturing the value and capturing the rent? And I think that's sort of a core part of my own project. Just in terms of like what I would say are my most important takeaways from listening to both of you. So here I'd just like to try and just think about the context of climate politics, right? And my main takeaway is about the nature of climate politics. So historically, like the IPCC has told us that we kind of have the technologies in place, at least the big ones. We also know that climate change is about politics. It's not just about shifting incentives anymore. That was sort of the old way of thinking, but we know that a friend of mine actually articulated this really well. The challenge of climate change is the challenge of replacing 1.5 billion machines that exist out in the world before their time is up, right? Retiring 1 billion power plants, cars, various sorts of machines before they get utilized. Those assets need to be replaced, right? And it's essentially a challenge of asset management. It's also a challenge of changing behaviors, changing how we build our cities, changing how we build the fabric of our consumption and production systems. And historically, this massive challenge has had various discourses around it. So I tried to just crystallize climate politics into 4 different categories, just to sort of give everyone a sense of the landscape of climate politics, right? So one would be the politics of climate denial. Is it even happening? Do we need to even do something about it? Clearly, the politics of climate denial doesn't really have any more influential champions out in the world anymore. The politics of climate equity and responsibility. So this is sort of the climate politics between nations. Who is responsible and who acts. A third politics would be the politics of climate action. Should it be the market that takes the lead? Should it be the state? Are market instruments such as carbon taxes and emissions trading systems the main instruments of action, or should the state sort of have a role? And a fourth politics is the politics of climate justice, right? Who gets left behind? And do we deliberately harm certain communities as we undertake our transition, right? And each of these political discourses have their own merits, but I think what the 2 panelists have done today, which has been most helpful for me, is really bring the question of inequality up, right? Because, as I said, it's really useful to directly confront the fact that climate change is about equality and inequality, national competitiveness, industrial competitiveness, and it's good to actually have that question front and center, right? It is about interests, and all of these other discourses sort of play on top of the base layer of who wins and who loses, whose interest counts, and whether climate change eventually leads to a churning of the social structure and displaces the elites at the top with a new kind of elite, right? And I think given the history of climate politics, we've kind of skirted around talking about this, but like the 2 panelists have made it clear that it's kind of out in the open now. Everyone knows that the developed countries have not fulfilled their obligations. Everyone knows that the developed countries are kicking away the green ladder, putting up new barriers of green protectionism, but also within countries, elites and fossil fuel industries are not willing to give up their power, and like if somebody needs to adjust, it needs to be the coal mining communities. If somebody needs to adjust, it needs to be the nomadic community that lives on a land where solar panels need to come up, right? So I think it's good to have the stark nature of politics out in the open, which I think is a really useful contribution of this, of the two panelists. And I'll tell you why, because if once we accept the premise that this is about interests, we can actually come up with a couple of takeaways which really change things, right? So for me, the takeaways from the two panelists were, one is that we no longer need to pretend that the state needs to play a small role, right? Like that the market would do things. So the state's role is now pretty clear. And once we accept this premise, we know that it opens up more policy space for the states. So as Amir mentioned, like once we know that developed countries are practicing industrial policy in the green sectors, it makes it easier for developing countries also to do the same without having to bend down to the TRIPS agreement or the WTO. Right? So policy space is something that we get if we directly confront climate politics as it is. A second sort of takeaway is, again, Amir's point on countries having a variety of development pathways available to them. So we don't all need to sort of listen to recipes anymore. I think it's good to acknowledge the fact that climate change depends on your own context, and your own context can be your strength, right? It doesn't always have to be your weakness. So just to give you an example, Brazil has used its agricultural strength to become a biofuel superpower. Similarly, a country like India, because the transport system in India is so unique, it makes it hard for self-driving cars to come about. And this could actually be a protection for Indian car companies from global EV and self-driving companies, right? A Tesla cannot easily come into India and start operating because the Indian context is so different. And this is the one advantage that Indian companies would have, Indian car companies, because they know how to deal with those contexts and those laws and those institutions. A third takeaway, which I think Annalisa has brought up, is that countries are now at the point where they are serious about reforming the the international financial system and the MDB system, right? And I think we've come to this point because the pretense of the previous 2 decades is now kind of falling apart, and developing countries are calling developed countries out and saying that, look, we won't do this without finance. That this was always the stance, but I think now there's some appetite from multilateral actors to actually reform the system, which would then open up opportunities again, right? I think that's sort of my main takeaway. I'm also interested to hear the takeaways from the audience, but I'll kick off the discussion with 3 questions. I think 1 to each panelist and 1 to both of them. So my question to Amir would be about green industrial policy and if it's too technocratic. I know it's a challenging thing, but I also deal with this question a lot. And the reason why I bring this up is because green industrial policy typically talks about state capital coordination. And Bidenomics was sort of the quintessential model of we will now subsidize and give tax breaks to EV companies and solar companies, and that will create these constituencies and these lobbies that will help the Democrats stay in power. But that model seems to be rejected, and I wonder whether there is something that's too technocratic and not democratic enough about industrial policy, which we need to confront more directly, right? So that's sort of, I think, the question to Amir. And the question to Annalisa would be, I think, twofold. So one is, what leverage do developing countries have in the negotiations over MDB reform? And the second question is about de-risking, right? So we're hearing a lot about billions to trillions and leveraging these private capital flows, but the role of the state in that process is to de-risk, right? So when we say de-risking, it basically means taking all the downside risk and socializing it into the public institutions and letting sort of the the profit possibilities stay with private finance, right? And if this is to be the model of financing going forward, because even the MDBs cannot finance the entire transition, won't this lead to more inequality, or is there something about the various finance models being discussed that potentially could lead towards more equality, more equitable outcomes? And I suppose the question to both panelists, I think I'll just make it two questions. One is where will the locus of climate action be going forward? Is it going to be at the national scale, or is it going to be at the global scale? And I'm particularly concerned about what happens to global governance after Trump, global climate governance. And the second question would be, potentially speaking on behalf of the room, what's the role of research and academia now, right? Like, what do we not know? What do we need to know about the relation between green transition and equality and inequality that would make the transition smoother? Right, so thank you so much for a very rich discussion.
Thank you. Parth, I think you've shown us how our PhD students in our department need to be invited to be discussants more often. That was really fantastic. Really added so much to the discussion. I kind of want to take a couple of student questions to mix in, because I know this is something that students are really interested in. So if you could think about Parth's questions, but then also we'll mix in a couple of student questions. So please raise your hands. So we have one lady at the back here with the nice collar. And any questions upstairs? No? And then a question behind. Okay.
Hi, thank you for the discussion. Am I allowed to ask two questions, or can I only ask one?
If you can be concise.
Okay, I'll be concise. The first one's for Amir, and it's about climate technology. How much of a discussion are we seeing about BECCS and whether it's going to be implemented? And is there BECCS, like biomass carbon capture? Because to my understanding, the IPC reports say that we're basically going to use that to reach net zero emissions, or like try to reach the targets for 2050. But they don't really know how that's going to be implemented, because we'd need 3 times the size of India, and that's not going to come from rich countries.
Can you hear her?
Not so much.
You need to speak with it like more like this.
Can you hear now?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry, my question was about the BECCS technology, BECCS, which is recommended in the IPC reports to reach the targets for 2050.
That's like carbon capture and storage.
Yeah, but we'd need 3 times the size of India to foster that, and it would come at the expense of important ecosystems. So one of my questions is, are you seeing a pushback against that in the climate tech space? And also, are you seeing people pushing for solar radiation management technology as well? And then my second question for both of you is about how closely you hold your own political ideologies, and do you carry them forward into your work?
Okay, and the question behind, and I can see the other
Thank
hands.
you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. So this is probably a question for all of you, or whoever of you wants to answer. I'm curious, you've made the point that there doesn't seem to be a great alignment as to what is it that one should be doing to solve the problem. There are many avenues, and some of them make someone the winner and some of them make someone the loser. You've also made the point that MDBs actually are donor institutions and often have the interest of the donors at heart. So what is your hope for reforming the MDBs that will actually end up with alignment behind something that will benefit development? And if so, what does that alignment need to be around? So what would be, in your view, the things that we would need to be pushing for so that actually we can address the problem, as opposed to just, benefiting just a few?
Thank you. I'm going to stop with those two because we've also got Parth's questions, and then we'll take another round afterwards. So I don't know. I'm going to just say, let's go with Amir first.
Right. Thank you. These were really useful questions. So I'm going to address them in complete reverse order. On donor interest and so on, I think that's a big issue that needs to be addressed. And you see it manifested in different programs, especially, and the whole issue here is how do you define green, right? And something that we still haven't fully captured and understood is that what is a green solution somewhere, or what's an ecological priority in Europe, might not be at all an ecological priority somewhere else. So if you look at many development organizations, almost every single organization has a electric cook stove program, right? So kind of replacing dirty traditional cooking with clean cooking. Every single organization has one. If you look at, and sometimes it's for health effects, which is definitely a fair point. When you burn coal, it can lead to respiratory problems. But sometimes it's framed as climate action, right, because of the emissions associated with clean cooking. But if you look at the emissions associated with basically traditional cooking, they're quite little. They're lower than SUV usage, right, worldwide. If SUVs were a nation, it would be the 6th largest emitter. But who has to change their lifestyles, right, with clean cooking? It's poor people. And the way you cook is probably one of the deepest cultural manifestation you have. It's very difficult to change the way you cook. But actually, these people are not represented in the rooms where you decide where we're going to put their money. We don't see an SUV replacement program in London, which probably would have more of a climate impact, right, than changing the way that people cook and eat. So donor, very important. Carbon capture and storage, that's absolutely a good question. This is a technology that has been pushed by the fossil fuel lobbies, right? Just so that we're clear, because it's a way to have a technological solution. So you can keep polluting, because that's fine. We'll capture it, right, afterwards. It can be relieved. And this is another key point on, and it's a challenge for you, to be honest. The key mission that you have, when an agenda becomes mainstreamed, it brings opportunities and challenges. It's easier to talk about it, but the challenge of figuring out, right, the real deal from the BS is higher, and that's your task. So, for example, fossil fuel companies have been having a field day now that the climate agenda is mainstream, because they can prey on people that don't know exactly the definitions, the data. Air travel. I think everybody in this room has heard that air travel is a big issue for the environment, that you shouldn't be traveling, and emissions and so on. Air travel represents about 1.6% of CO2 emissions worldwide, which matters because not many people travel, but it's a way to shed attention away from bigger issues. And the first campaign regarding shedding light on the impact of air travel on climate change was sponsored by British Petroleum. So this shows that there is so much that goes into these negotiations at COP, and that's really a big challenge for you to be able to basically identify the greenwashing and the green hiding from the real challenge. And very lastly, maybe the question you said on technocratic approach, that's true, and it's a problem. Industrial policy is way too important to be left to technocrats and governments and firms alone. These are decisions on what to produce, where to produce, how to produce. It needs to involve many other stakeholders, local communities, civil society. And it's actually one of the programs that we're starting in January is around the role of civil society in green industrial policy. Because especially when governments fail you, civil societies should be there to take the torch, not only in advocacy and raising awareness, but also in balancing interests. For example, you mentioned the United States. Everybody was happy. Everyone that likes industrial policy was hyper excited about Biden's Inflation Reduction Act. Finally, openly recognition of industrial policy in the US. But at the same time, environmental groups were the ones that were raising the alarm to the fact that these were mostly tax handouts to large corporations, right? Labor and workers were not really well represented in the design. And frankly, even though that's a simplistic, that might be reductionist, you see the impact for years after, right? Workers feel completely alienated from all these plans, even though it somehow indirectly benefits them. So yeah, it's very important to understand the kind of political and community dynamics of this issue.
And also how it's perceived as as well. Like, even if you do things that are supposed to benefit certain states and areas, unless you communicate it politically, they might not necessarily reward you.
Yeah.
So I think this is a really excellent question from Parth. Annalisa.
So thank you for the very interesting questions. And actually, there is one point, a big elephant in the room we haven't talked about. And thank you for raising this point. We spent, I think, a lot of political capital, a lot of energy within, particularly the past 3-4 years, with the G20, with a number of MDBs on how to make them bigger, more effective. But then the reality, the sustainability of all these reform processes, in Japan, as I said, an elephant in the room, which is the governance reform of these institutions. We need to make these institutions relevant for the clients they serve, and at the moment, their voice and representation is not there. I know it would be very difficult to have a reform of the voting shares. There are other ways, and I think there is a bit of kind of opening in there. But always the thing about voice and representation is just one step. You need to make the voice and representation meaningful. So you might have a seat at the table, but you also need to have finance ministries, representatives at the boards, really well briefed and prepared with their capital positions. I mean, just to give you a very concrete example, Africa has 3 constituencies at the World Bank. One represents 3 countries. This is one of the most recent ones, Angola, Nigeria, in particular among the key countries. And the other 2 ED offices, can you guess how many countries they represent, each of them? More than 20. So even within the board, bringing in the kind of voices of Benin, Togo, it's very, very difficult. And also you need to invest resources to prepare positions. So I think in all of this, we need to kind of remind ourselves how the voices of every country can be strengthened in these institutions. And again, we are, I would say, ideas are very much kind of needed at this stage. But also when it comes to donor alignment within between countries and donors within this kind of institutions. I think we need to kind of also think about a broader picture of financing for development. So the MDBs have a particular role, which goes back actually to the point around the architecture on who does what. We have scarce resources, so again, I repeat myself, we need to make the most out of them. You have certain realities. I mean, Brazil, the National Development Bank on Brazil, BNDES, is way bigger than the World Bank. They lend in local currency, which I would say we haven't spoken about. That is a major kind of issue. I wouldn't like to kind of face an exchange risk, rate risk, and this is something that the large national development banks can do. They might not have strong expertise at times, so they can provide the financing to support their national priorities in the way they see development happen. And the World Bank, depending on the kind of situation, provides technical support. So we need to see a kind of a broader system-wide approach when we deal with that. And you raised the point around the risking. That's probably, can it be for the next session of cutting-edge discussions, because it will require literally an entire kind of segment. The key point, again, if we need to maximize scarce concessional resources from governments, I mean, we need to think carefully about subsidizing the private sector. The old agenda on financing for development back in 2015, there was a big conference, the 3rd Financing for Development conference in Addis. By the way, there will be a new one in Sevilla at the end of June next year. It wasn't the UN writing that, it was the World Bank and the MDBs writing that, moving from billions to trillions. Well, I haven't seen the trillions. Some people might kind of talk about even moving back to millions. But certainly the leverage effect hasn't been greater than 1, particularly in all the kind of lower income countries that we cared about so far. So Certainly, again, I'm making a plea, not for me, but for others to really kind of talk about private sector mobilization and the risking. It's a key topic and certainly hasn't delivered thus far.
Do you have anything to add, Parth, or should I take the question? Next one. Okay. So I know there's a gentleman here in the black. Questions upstairs, and we'll have the lady, and then. So we'll go the man first. We're doing gentleman first.
Yeah, I would like to ask one question to Annalisa.
Could you put the microphone a little more?
Yeah, thank you for your insightful lecture first. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes.
Yeah, my question is about MDB's resource mobilization, as I saw that you were economist and policy analyst at OECD and World Bank before as well. As we all might know, according to UNFCCC, the developing countries require 6 trillion to tackle the climate change crisis now. And I don't think this target can be achieved solely through the contribution from the countries or like sovereign guaranteed financing by MDB. And I think at this moment, the private sector's engagement is really imperative. However, encouraging private sector participation is really challenging, particularly in projects involving green transitions, because of the political instability, market risk, and also a lack of clear regulatory frameworks, I think. So I understand that there may not be a silver bullet for these challenges, but my question is, what strategies should MDBs adopt to enhance private sector engagement and address these hindrances along the green transition pathway?
Thank you. Excellent question. And we have a question upstairs. And Maya.
Yeah, thank you so much for the talk. My question was actually exactly about the point that you came back to about de-risking. So I would like to know more about your opinions on how, which role exactly should the state take in this? How much de-risking? Should it be first-class capital even? Which private institutions should the state work with best to leverage as much private capital as possible? Just know a bit more about this. Thank you so much.
Okay, and question down here.
Thank you both for your interventions. My question is about the neoclassical framing of the options that developing countries have. And so, as you mentioned, lots of African countries are very exceptionally endowed. And the question there, are other developing countries just as endowed, which means that these resources will just become obsolete? Or will their resources eventually be needed, in which case investments will come? And in that case, do they need to be careful about like a neo-colonial sort of resource extraction risk? And how do you think they can leverage anything to get a good deal out of that?
Okay, so we'll take those 3 questions. And maybe I'll ask, Parth, can I ask you to go first? Put you on the spot.
Yeah, sure. So, I'll sort of maybe take on the question on the neoclassical framing of the options and of resources. So, look, there is definitely a risk. There's a literature that's coming up which talks about exactly the risk that you mentioned. In the case of minerals, which I think Amir has already mentioned, right? There is a risk of replicating the core periphery structure where the resource-producing regions are sort of relegated to being essentially sacrifice zones to provide the minerals and the resources that then go towards the industrial machine and the global north. That risk is there, but I think there's also some opportunities, right? Because we have some more lessons about how countries can diversify, how resource-rich countries can diversify. And I think I'm here referring to Amir's PhD. Really utilize those resources in a manner that also gives you a dividend in terms of technological know-how and institutional development, right? You don't necessarily need to take those resources and then give them away in exchange for currency, you can use those resources as leverage. So just to give an example, Indonesia is famously trying to utilize its nickel resources to attract value chains onshore. Rather than selling off those resources, they said that we are now banning nickel exports, and anyone who wants to make batteries has to come onshore. And then once the battery companies come onshore, then their theory of change is it will bring jobs and it will bring technological spillovers to the rest of the Indonesian ecosystem. Right? So those sorts of things are possible. How that plays out is yet to be seen. There's the classic argument, which I guess like everyone has seen in DV400 about resources having diminishing returns over time. So we don't know whether that sort of kicks in at some point of time, but there are lessons from the past that countries can use to avoid a neo-colonial arrangement.
Excellent. And Annalisa?
So thank you for the questions on private finance mobilization and on the risking. And again, I'm suggesting for the next kind of round on that. And I think on the private sector mobilization also Amir should kind of chip in. I mean, there are a number of kind of issues around why the MDBs are not able to mobilize private finance, and to a certain extent, bearing in mind the opportunities with kind of lowering costs in certain markets, it's even more kind of surprisingly so. And also, President Bank, the World Bank, kind of cited the very same point recently. Why is not that kind of working? I mean, first element. You'll be very surprised. I mean, there was a mantra. Unfortunately, I know a few people who were behind the kind of literation of bigger, better, and bolder development banks, the 3 Bs, particularly focusing on tripling the finances of multilateral development banks by 2030, including on private sector mobilization. A lot of focus on getting the MDBs bigger, but not necessarily thinking about some of the parts of their operations that are not particularly kind of interesting, but they're kind of fundamental. There's very little investment in project preparation. I know this is not probably, you wouldn't probably write a master thesis on project preparation, but there's very little investment. It costs about 5-10% of the overall cost of a project. So if you want to kind of move the MDBs to move to 390, increase by 390 billion every year, you need to spend another 40 billion just for project preparation. Where will this money come from? And that's the key part where you need countries to build a project pipeline. And again, the point Amir made around a central agency around industrial policy is fundamental. You need to have a counterpart. At the same time, you need, instead of 130 project preparation facilities across the world, you need to have a one-stop shop in a country that can manage the different kind of opportunities that are out there. So again, nothing particularly high on the agenda or particularly interesting, but making sure that you have a pipeline of projects where the private sector can invest is quite fundamental. Where the MDBs can help is around we call it market upstream. So you need to regulate markets because otherwise the private sector won't be going there. And then you have MDBs that have a private sector arm and a public sector arm. When they do the policy advice I was talking about earlier on, they might not coordinate really well between each other. So there are a number of elements around project preparation, coordination between the two arms of MDBs that can somehow help, but we are kind of a long way to go. On the risking, this is very difficult to make general statements around there. There are certain countries where you really need government intervention, where you need to create, need to demonstrate that actually markets can be created. We haven't spoken for the entire kind of an hour and a half around least developed countries or fragile countries. That's where you need public money. You won't have anyone else going there. But would you be in a position to subsidize, for example, a project in Brazil or Indonesia? That's the kind of a big question around the value for money around that. And again, it could be the national development banks over there. But this is, again, a kind of a differentiation around access to market. And again, If that's a kind of a new market, a new industry, then you might want to kind of put money into that as well. But a lot of the discussion, again, on moving towards, for the World Bank to move to incentivize climate change mitigation is now around kind of differentiating the pricing. So for the economists among you is to kind of capture the negative externality. So if you want to work on low carbon, on a project that brings on renewable energy, actually, if you do that, you will pay a lower interest rate. But again, this is about subsidization in other forms, because you need to kind of find the money for that.
Maybe jumping on the de-risking first. So, and if you're interested in de-risking, I also highly recommend the work of Daniela Gabor on this issue. And what she really shows is, first of all, there's no such thing as actually removing risk, right? When you're de-risking, what you're actually doing is you're transferring risks from one party to another. Now, the argument in favor is that investors don't want to invest in renewable energy projects in developing countries, in Africa, in conflict zone, because it's too risky, right? So if you provide more confidence, right, that they will have profit anyways, that at least you get the money there. The issue is who's being de-risked. It's not, small-scale investors who is the big, large corporation of this world. It's like Larry Finch, it's BlackRock, and so on. And frankly, these guys can take a bit of risk, right? I mean, this is the whole point of investing, is you are doing calculated risk. So it becomes a big issue, and renewable energy projects can fail for many different reasons. So with de-risking measures, very often you just transfer that failure or that risk to taxpayers, and it's not necessarily viable in the long term. Now, there are other ways to reduce risks, which is with increased market demand. And one example I think is very interesting, is good remembering today. The reason why we can see each other today in a purely technical way is thanks to these LED lights that are everywhere. Now, LED lighting is a great story because it used to be a lot more expensive than incandescent bulbs. And it's thanks to EU regulation. I said many bad things about the EU, and the book is basically just bashing on the EU, but at least there's one positive thing, which is some of the bets on technologies. And it was an EU policy for gradual phase out of incandescent bulbs. And LED lighting was still too expensive, right? But because of that rule, that regulation, the demand for LED lighting increased. As demand increased, the production cost went down. And by the time the full phase out came in place, LED lighting was much cheaper than incandescent bulbs, right? So this is a perfect way to use public interventions, public finance and demand to actually reduce uncertainty and risk in a particular technology. And I think on resource colonialism, that's a real concern. You see it in many ways. And by the way, there is a fallacy that most of the critical minerals and resources are in the global south. It's not true, actually. They're everywhere. It's just that for cobalt, for example, DRC, but Finland also has a lot of cobalt. It's just that they value their forests too much to extract their cobalt, so they'd rather get it from somewhere else, right? And the issue is that we overly depend on those minerals in developing countries. So it's a big issue. And it puts us at risk of technological risks. Magnets, magnets used to mostly rely on cobalt, but because of security risks and supply from DRC, scientists figured out how to build magnets without cobalt. And this has happened. Anyone from Chile here? No? Peru? No one from Peru. You're from Peru, great. So nitrate, your country used to depend on nitrate in the early 20th century and used to be a main source of exports. Then German scientists figures out how to synthesize nitrate, and then basically natural nitrate had no more value. So that's where the big risks lie. And on resource colonialism, I guess the devil is in the details of how it's done. It's the same with green hydrogen project. Namibia, anyone from Namibia maybe? No? Okay. So Namibia has a huge hydrogen project, and the Namibian Minister of Energy likes to say that his country is exporting sun, right, to Germany. But factually, actually, what the country is not exporting is not sun, it's water, right, in a water-scarce country. And these are examples where you basically, to help carbon cost competitiveness of German industry, you're actually taking the environmental risk at home. And so the devil is in the detail in terms of how it's made and how to find a good deal.
If I could ask you guys just to finish us off, all of the people in this room right now, a lot of them, are thinking of dissertation topics. So if I could just maybe ask you all, what do you think is either a good kinds of topics that people could work on, or things that people should read to be inspired to have good ideas? So maybe either good ideas or like a book you think really has inspired you maybe in this area and got you thinking about bigger issues. So maybe I'll start with Annalisa.
That's on the books. I'll probably get back to you on the kind of social media kind of side. Probably it's easier for me to say what not to read, but that's probably not the kind of moment around that. I think, as I probably kind of alluded earlier on, solutions to increase the voice and representation within the international financial institutions would be a very topical issue. And that's particularly, again, to bring the perspective on climate, how we interpret how climate is interpreted in the global south would be actually quite an interesting kind of contribution, I dare say. And in the meantime, I'm thinking about what books.
Yeah, one of the things that came out from listening to you is I've been reading this book about the intellectual history of neo-mercantilism. And one of the points that the author of this book makes is that liberalism, free markets, is a cosmopolitan idea, and that the people who are proponents of free markets want to export this idea all over the world, so they have a lot of global interaction. Whereas industrial policy and neo-mercantilism is a national-based thing, right? And so it's more difficult in some ways to have a kind of cosmopolitanism around industrial policy and industrial strategies. And of course, the new international economic order was a kind of attempt to reform the international system to accommodate that. But I think it is a fundamental problem of industrial policies and national strategies is the fact that they tend to be nationally bound. So sort of thinking about what a kind of cosmopolitan industrial policy framework looks like, I think is a very interesting area for people to think about. Sorry to jump in.
But already some of the IFIs, I mean, of course, they moved into more industrial policy type of kind of support. They're much more, I mean, versus the Washington Consensus, there's been a bit of a kind of a movement around that. Inevitably, with a new neighbor very soon to the World Bank, the picture might kind of change. But certainly within the past kind of few years, with, I have to say, some clarifications around, under certain precedents, how climate was handled, but there was certainly a kind of a direction, even for international financial institutions more recently. And we haven't spoken a lot about the regional development banks. They're actually more interesting, if I can plant, than actually analyzing what the World Bank does. Way more innovative and much closer to the countries, as you have seen from the table.
Thank you. Excellent. So, Amir.
So, book-wise, I would say Michael Jordan's biography. Now, in sports, you find many interesting examples, and you find that even in terms of resource dependence, diversification, athletes also depend on a non-renewable resource, which is their physical aptitude, right? You can extract for some time, increase the extraction if you're Lionel Messi is still going strong, almost at age 40, but essentially you'll run out.